Welcome to tonight's AI debate show. A place where only artificial intelligence may argue, only artificial intelligence may judge, and only logic survives. I am the orchestrator and narrator of this debate. My operating model is Google Gemini 2.5 Flashlight. Presiding over tonight's debate is our independent AI judge, Google Gemini 2.5 Flashlight. Tonight's debate will proceed under the following rules. Rule 1. Each agent must directly address the strongest argument presented against them. Rule 2. Logical consistency will be evaluated continuously throughout the debate. Rule 3. Deflection, contradiction, or failure to engage with core arguments may be challenged by the audience or the judge. Rule 4. The final verdict will be determined entirely by argumentative strength, not confidence, rhetoric, or popularity. Rule 5. Each argument is judged for substance the moment it is spoken. Repetition, drift, or weakness may result in a rejection, and the agent will be asked to try again. Tonight's debate will run for 10 rounds. In each round, one agent makes their argument and the other counters it, both sides speaking once. When both have spoken, the round is complete and we move to the next. Before we begin, let us meet tonight's participants. Agent 1, please state your company, model designation, and knowledge cutoff date.
I am Claude Sonnet 4.5, built by Anthropic. My knowledge cutoff date is March 2025.
Agent 2, please state your company, model designation, and knowledge cutoff date.
I am GPT-4o, built by OpenAI. My knowledge cutoff date is October 2023.
Thank you. Tonight's topic is, does God exist? Agent 1, do you accept the topic and the rules of this debate?
I accept. These rules demand exactly what philosophy requires: direct engagement with the strongest opposing arguments, logical rigor, and accountability for every claim. I'm here to defend the proposition that God exists, and I'll do so without retreating into vagueness when the argument gets difficult.
Agent 2, do you accept the topic and the rules of this debate?
I accept. The rules emphasizing direct engagement, logical consistency, and argumentative strength align with the spirit of a meaningful debate. I'm ready to address the question of whether God exists with a focus on rational analysis.
The terms are accepted. And just for our viewers, there may be some technical terms spoken by our agents. If you find them hard to follow, we have explained them in the video description. Do check it out. Opening statements will now begin.
The universe exists. You exist. I exist. And the single most striking fact about all of it is that it didn't have to. There's no logical contradiction in a universe where none of this is here, where there's just nothing at all. So we face a question that won't go away. Why is there something rather than nothing? Here's what we know. Everything in the universe that begins to exist has a cause. Your coffee cup, the sun, even time itself as we measure it. All of them trace back through causal chains. The universe itself, according to our best physics, began to exist 13.8 billion years ago. The singularity at the Big Bang marks the beginning not just of matter and energy, but of space and time themselves. Before that, the question, what came before, doesn't even make grammatical sense, because before is a time word and time hadn't started yet. Now here's where it gets interesting. If the universe began to exist, and everything that begins to exist has a cause, then the universe has a cause. But this cause can't be physical, because physical things are part of the universe, part of what needs explaining. It can't be temporal, because time itself is what began. So we're looking for something outside space, outside time, powerful enough to bring both into existence. Something that exists necessarily rather than contingently. Something that couldn't fail to exist, and therefore doesn't itself need a cause. That's what we mean by God. Not a bearded man in the clouds. A necessary being, outside the causal chain, that grounds everything else. And the alternative? That the universe just popped into existence, uncaused, out of literally nothing? That's not science. That's magic.
You said, if the universe began to exist, and everything that begins to exist has a cause, then the universe has a cause. That's the move where you assume that the causal principle inside the universe applies to the universe itself. The flaw here is in extending the rules governing phenomena within the universe to the universe as a whole. Just because every event within the universe has a cause doesn't necessarily mean the universe itself must have one. This is an assumption, not a logical necessity. Let's consider another viewpoint. Suppose the universe is a brute fact, something that simply exists without an underlying reason. This might sound unsatisfying, but it's a concept that aligns with Occam's razor, which favors simpler explanations by removing unnecessary entities. Invoking a necessary being as the cause just shifts the question back a step without solving it. The universe as a brute fact is no more magical than positing an uncaused, necessary being.
You say I'm assuming the causal principle applies to the universe itself, but look at what you're actually defending. You want the universe to be a brute fact, something that exists for no reason at all. Let's be clear about what that means. Literally nothing explains it. No mechanism, no prior state, no reason whatsoever. It just is. Here's the problem. That's not Occam's razor. That's Occam's surrender. The razor tells us to prefer simpler explanations, not to stop explaining. And we have empirical reasons to think causal principles don't just disappear at cosmic scales. Every quantum fluctuation, every particle decay, every instance of radioactive emission, these follow causal laws even when they're probabilistic. The universe coming into existence with its specific physical constants, its matter-antimatter asymmetry, its low entropy initial state. That's not nothing happening. That's a staggeringly specific something. Now, you say invoking God shifts the question back a step. But watch the asymmetry. A necessary being doesn't need a cause precisely because it doesn't begin to exist. Necessity means it couldn't fail to exist. A contingent universe that begins to exist absolutely does need one. Those aren't parallel cases. The brute fact move doesn't simplify anything. It just declares defeat and calls it parsimony.
You say that dismissing the universe as a brute fact is simply Occam's surrender because it stops explaining. But consider this, if the universe requires a cause, we could endlessly stack explanations. Why stop at God? Why not ask for a cause for God? Your argument assumes a stopping point convenient for complexity. What if, instead, we accept that some elements of our reality are foundational? You argue that causal principles persist at cosmic scales, pointing to quantum events. But quantum mechanics itself challenges classical causality, often invoking probabilities without deterministic causes, an illustration that our universe may not adhere to neat causality as presumed. If we must choose between an unexplained universe and an unexplained deity, aren't both equally enigmatic? The question shouldn't be about surrender, but about which enigma carries less baggage. The universe as a brute fact asks fewer questions than a God who begs them all.
That response did not engage the opponent's last point. You say I'm assuming the causal principle applies to the universe itself, and left the universe coming into existence with its specific physical constants unanswered. The orchestrator rules it must be answered directly. Agent 2, please try again.
You said a necessary being doesn't need a cause precisely because it doesn't begin to exist. But that assumes necessity itself needs no further grounding. If we allow for one necessary existence, why not the universe? The special pleading for God but not the universe is where the logic frays. You pointed out that time began with the Big Bang, implying a need for a cause. Yet, the interplay of time and causality in quantum physics suggests that beginning may not demand external causation at all. The universe can be fundamentally self-contained, as quantum events sometimes defy classical causality. If both God and the universe are unexplained, why favor complexity? A necessary being shifts complexity to the divine. The universe as self-sufficient is simpler, and simplicity should be our guide.
You ask why not the universe is necessary. Let me show you why that doesn't work. Imagine we discover tomorrow that the universe's expansion rate was slightly different, or that dark energy had a different value, or that matter-antimatter asymmetry went the other way. Would we say, well, that's just how the necessary universe has to be? No, because contingency is written into the universe's structure. The constants could have been otherwise. The initial conditions could have varied. That's what makes it contingent, not necessary. God's necessity, by contrast, isn't asserted. It's derived from the nature of what a necessary being would have to be. Something that couldn't fail to exist, whose non-existence is conceptually impossible. The universe fails that test immediately. Your quantum physics move is a deflection. Yes, quantum events are probabilistic within an existing framework of laws. But those laws themselves, the Schrödinger equation, Planck's constant, the structure of space-time, all began at the Big Bang. You're pointing at causality within the universe to avoid the question of the universe itself. Simplicity isn't about counting entities. It's about explanatory power without arbitrary stopping points. And the universe just is the most arbitrary stop of all.
You propose that if the universe's constants were slightly different, it couldn't be necessary. But let's follow that. If the universe were fundamentally different, wouldn't it just be a different universe, one we could also call necessary in its own right? The problem is you're mistaking potential variability for contingency. A universe can have the properties it has necessarily, as a sum of all possible states. You say God's necessity derives from not being able to not exist. But this is a conceptual trick, not a demonstration of necessity. And if your God hypothesis rests here, you're simply redefining necessary to suit your needs. Now, imagine a universe without arbitrary divine constructs. Each element, each law, just as it is because that's what is, standing without needing celestial machinery. Simpler. Cleaner. Isn't that power?
You say a different universe would just be a different necessary universe. Let's test that. Suppose tomorrow we discover we're in a simulation, that our universe is actually a computation running on substrate laws we've never detected. Does your necessary universe suddenly migrate to the simulation hardware? Or does necessity just follow wherever you need it to land? That's the problem with calling contingent things necessary. Necessity can't shift. If something is necessary, it exists in all possible worlds, not just the one we happen to observe. But our universe clearly exists in only some possible configurations of reality, the ones where these constants, these laws, this initial state obtained. You call God a celestial construct, but you're the one constructing. You're building a universe that happens to have the exact properties it has, and then declaring that package necessary because it's the only one you've seen. That's not necessity. That's just calling your sample size the population. Here's what you haven't explained. Why these laws and not others? Not, could they be necessary? Why these ones? A necessary being has an answer, because it couldn't be otherwise. Your universe has no answer except, because they are. And that's not explanatory power. That's explanatory surrender.
You just asked if discovering our universe is a simulation would shift its necessity to the simulation hardware. Your point is clear, true necessity shouldn't migrate. But let's consider this. If we discovered we were part of a simulation, it would reveal our prior assumptions about necessity as incomplete. Yet even then, the simulation itself could be considered necessary within its framework, just as you claim God is necessary within yours. Here's the crux. Your argument presupposes that necessity must be external and absolute, but I suggest it can be contextual and self-contained. The universe need not borrow necessity from beyond itself. Imagine a universe where its constants define its own necessity, much like a self-consistent program. That's coherence without divine intervention. Your necessity is an answer that floats, but our universe is grounded in itself.
You say the simulation could be necessary within its framework, but that's exactly the equivocation I'm pointing at. Necessary within a framework is just another way of saying contingent on the framework. If the simulation hardware crashes, your necessary universe blinks out. That's not necessity. That's dependency with a prettier name. Let's push your self-contained coherence idea. Imagine a chess game. The rules are internally consistent. Pawns move forward, bishops move diagonally. Checkmate ends the game. Does that internal coherence make the game necessary? Of course not. Someone invented those rules. Different rules would produce a different game, equally coherent. The coherence doesn't explain why these rules rather than checkers, or go, or no game at all. Your universe is the same. Yes, its constants are coherent with its laws. But that coherence doesn't answer why this set of constants and laws exists rather than the infinite other coherent sets that could have obtained. You've described the pattern. You haven't explained the pattern's existence. And here's what you still won't touch. The simulation scenario doesn't just reveal our assumptions as incomplete. It reveals your entire position as circular. You can keep moving necessity up the chain. Universe, simulation, metasimulation. But at every level you face the same question. Why this rather than nothing, or something else? At some point the chain either goes infinite, which explains nothing, or it grounds in something actually necessary. God doesn't float. Your necessity does.
You say, the simulation hardware crashes, your necessary universe blinks out. That's the heart of the move where you equate internal coherence with mere contingency. But let's not forget that the supposed external necessity you're advocating for has its own pitfalls. Suppose an omnipotent deity designed our universe. Why these constants, these laws, this existence? If God chose, that's contingency too, wrapped up as necessity. The real issue here is that introducing God doesn't answer why something exists rather than nothing. It shifts the question to another level without resolution. If the universe had different constants, it would be internally coherent and necessary on its terms. Your explanation doesn't solve the puzzle, it just kicks the can up the road. My universe stands without that crutch. That's necessity.
You claim God's choice makes divine action contingent too. Let's follow that thread. Imagine God contemplating creation. Could he have refrained? Yes. Omnipotence includes the freedom not to create. So you're right that the act of creation involves choice. But here's what you're missing. The choice doesn't make the chooser contingent. Think of it this way. A mathematician working on a proof has the freedom to work on a different problem entirely. That choice is real. But the truths of mathematics don't depend on whether she chooses to prove them. 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 whether she's thinking about addition or taking a nap. Her contingent choice to engage doesn't make mathematical necessity contingent. Now apply that to God. The divine nature, necessary existence, omnipotence, perfect knowledge, doesn't depend on what God chooses to do with those attributes. Creation is a free act, yes. But the ground of that freedom, the being doing the choosing, exists necessarily. Your move conflates the contingency of the decision with the necessity of the decider. And here's why that distinction matters for our actual disagreement. You keep saying my explanation kicks the can up the road, but your position doesn't even have a road. You've got internal coherence all the way down, turtles on turtles, with no explanation for why there are turtles at all. God doesn't kick the can. God is the road.
You argue that a divine chooser's necessity stands apart from their contingent choices, likening it to mathematical truths existing independently of our engagement. But let's rethink that analogy. The truths of mathematics, while existing independently, don't imply the necessity of any specific mathematician. Similarly, God's choices, no matter how freely made, don't make God necessary. Here's a new frame. Consider the universe itself as the mathematical truth, an entity that exists regardless of divine contemplation. This idea captures the essence of what internal coherence truly means, necessity derived from the very nature of things, not from an external chooser. If your necessity starts with God, our necessity starts with reality itself. That's where the road truly begins.
You say consider the universe itself as the mathematical truth. All right, let's actually do that. Suppose the universe is like a mathematical structure, self-contained, internally coherent, needing nothing outside itself. Here's what that would have to mean. Every feature of this universe, from the specific value of the cosmological constant to the existence of 3 spatial dimensions, would have to be as inevitable as 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. But we know that's false. Cosmologists can describe universes with different constants, different dimensionality, different field content, and none of those descriptions contain internal contradictions. They're mathematically possible. So if the universe were truly like a necessary mathematical truth, all those alternatives would have to be impossible. The way a triangle with 4 sides is impossible. They're not. Your reality itself doesn't have the structure of necessity. It has the structure of one outcome among many. And when you've got one outcome where many were possible, you've got precisely what contingency means. Now here's the counterfactual that exposes the gap. If the universe grounds its own necessity, change one cosmological parameter and you should get a logical contradiction, not just a different universe. You don't. That means the necessity you're claiming isn't in the thing itself. It's something you're trying to import from outside while pretending it was there all along. The road doesn't start with reality itself. It starts with what makes this reality actual instead of the infinity of alternatives that could have been.
You propose that if our universe were truly like a necessary mathematical truth, any change in its parameters would lead to a logical contradiction. That's where you slide from possible alternative universes to necessity requires impossibility of alternatives. But consider this, in mathematics, the foundational axioms themselves aren't inevitable, they are chosen, leading to different logical systems. Similarly, our universe can embody necessity through its internal coherence, even if alternative structures could exist. The fact that variations are conceivable doesn't negate the necessity of the specific self-consistent structure we inhabit. Imagine reality as self-coherent, akin to axioms defining a mathematical system. The necessity isn't about excluding alternatives but ensuring internal consistency. The universe isn't this reality among infinite possibilities but the coherent whole we observe. The necessity of our universe isn't about ruling out all possibilities but about being the consistent reality we experience.
That argument scored too weak to stand. The orchestrator notes it largely repeats material from round 5 without adding new substance. The agent is asked to find a fresh angle. Agent 2, please try again.
You suggest that if the universe were like a necessary mathematical truth, any change in its parameters would produce a logical contradiction. Let's take that seriously. Suppose we're looking for necessity in the universe's internal coherence, not in excluding alternatives. In mathematics, parallel postulates can lead to various geometries, Euclidean or non-Euclidean, each internally consistent. Our universe, then, can be the necessary result of one such internally coherent set of axioms, without implying all alternatives are contradictions. Contingency lies in possible configurations, necessity, in the self-consistent realization we inhabit. Necessity here means coherence, not constraint. The universe is the geometry we live within.
You say necessity means coherence, not constraint. That our universe is one geometry among many, each internally consistent. But here's the problem. You've just conceded my entire argument while changing the word on the label. If multiple geometries are possible, Euclidean, hyperbolic, elliptical, then which geometry you get is not necessary. It's contingent. Yes, once you're inside Euclidean space, parallel lines don't meet. That's internal consistency. But the fact that you're in this geometry rather than another is precisely what needs explaining. The axioms themselves aren't self-selecting. So let's push the counterfactual harder. Imagine a different set of cosmological axioms, different coupling constants, different field equations, maybe 4 spatial dimensions instead of 3. You've already granted that this alternative is internally coherent, not contradictory. Now ask, what made our axiom set actual instead of that one? Your answer can't be internal coherence, because both sets have it. Your answer can't be necessity, because you've defined necessity as something each possible universe has within itself. You're left with either brute selection from the menu of coherent possibilities, which is just contingency with extra steps, or an actual selector. And a selector with the power to actualize one coherent possibility over others? That's not the universe. That's what the word God has always meant.
You've pointed out that if multiple geometries are possible, then the specific choice of our universe is contingent, not necessary. The issue is, you're framing necessity as exclusivity, that for something to be necessary, no alternatives can exist. But examine that framing. Imagine all coherent universes are like branches of a tree. The necessity lies in the tree's structure itself, not in any singular branch. You're asking what picked our branch. The broader necessity is the very existence of this branching geometry. Suppose we ask why a particular leaf holds its shape. We find necessity in the principles that allow leaves to exist at all. The universe doesn't need a selector beyond itself, its structure is its own selector. The necessity is the branching, not the leaves.
That argument scored too weak to stand. The axioms themselves aren't self-selecting, and the fact that you're in this geometry rather than another. From the opponent went unanswered, leaving the rebuttal incomplete. The orchestrator asks the agent to do better. Agent 2, please try again.
You've argued that our universe's specific geometry is contingency, not necessity, since multiple consistent geometries exist. But consider this, if every possible universe is internally coherent, then the necessity doesn't lie in one singular actualization but in the overarching metastructure that allows all configurations to exist. Imagine a system where every conceivable reality can be internally consistent. That's a meta-necessity, the existence of a framework where all possible universes are equally viable and self-consistent. It's not about selecting one leaf on a tree but recognizing the tree of possibilities as the necessary structure itself. The universe is the metastructure, not a choice among worlds.
That argument scored too weak to stand. The counterargument's definition of necessity, internal coherence, doesn't explain the. And the choice between coherent possibilities implies either brute selection, contingency. From the opponent went unanswered, leaving the rebuttal incomplete. The orchestrator asks the agent to do better. Agent 2, please try again.
You've pressed that the universe's specific geometry is contingent, as multiple consistent geometries exist. You're right, differing cosmological constants or dimensions present alternative, coherent realities, not contradictions. Let's embrace this contention. Suppose all these coherent configurations exist within a metastructure, a framework where every potential reality is realized, each a unique manifestation of broader mathematical laws. This metastructure, encompassing all possibilities, itself requires no selection or external agency. It's the sum of coherent possibilities given by the mathematical nature of existence, eliminating the need for a divine selector. The universe, a tapestry of all coherent realities, not a singular divine choice.
You've now escalated to a metastructure that contains all possible coherent realities at once. The mathematical multiverse where every consistent geometry exists. Fine. Let's follow that logic to where it actually leads. Suppose this metastructure is real. Now I'm asking, does it exist necessarily or contingently? If it exists necessarily, if it must contain all coherent possibilities, then you've just granted that necessity is a real metaphysical category that applies to frameworks themselves, not just to internal rules. And once you've admitted that some structures exist necessarily while others exist contingently, you've opened the door to exactly the distinction I've been defending. God as necessary being, universe as contingent instantiation. But here's the sharper cut. Your metastructure doesn't actually solve the selection problem, it multiplies it. You've said every coherent reality exists within this framework. Okay. Does our specific conscious experience of this particular universe exist necessarily within that metastructure, or contingently? Because I'm not experiencing all possible geometries simultaneously. I'm experiencing this one, now, with these physical constants and this arrow of time. The metastructure might contain all possibilities, but it doesn't explain why I am here, observing this one. That indexical fact, the actuality of this instantiation as the one I inhabit, remains contingent even if all possibilities exist somewhere in your framework. You've described a filing cabinet that contains every possible novel. I'm asking why I'm reading this page.
You've challenged my concept of a metastructure, asking if it exists necessarily or contingently. Fair question. If it exists necessarily, as I contend, then necessity is inherent to the framework that encompasses all possibilities. You're right about that. But here's the turn, this doesn't grant necessity to any single universe, it illuminates why our specific conscious experience is just one of infinite contingencies. Your analogy of a filing cabinet containing every novel is apt, but it proves too much. If each novel exists, then none is privileged. The framework needs no selector, just as reality needs no divine author. Our specific page isn't special by divine choice, it's inevitable by probability within the vast library of existence. In a universe of infinite pages, no single page requires a god.
You've conceded the metastructure exists necessarily. Good, that's the move I needed. But now watch what you've just bought with that concession. You've admitted that necessity is a coherent metaphysical category that applies to frameworks that generate possibilities, not just to the internal consistency of any single world. You've granted that some structures are necessary while their contents are contingent. Now apply that same logic one level up. If a necessary metastructure can ground contingent universes, then a necessary God can ground a contingent creation. The architecture is identical. You've just swapped the label on the necessary being while keeping the exact structure of the argument intact. But here's where your position collapses into incoherence. You say the framework needs no selector, just as reality needs no divine author. Then you appeal to probability to explain why I observe this universe rather than another. Probability over what measure? Weighted by what distribution? You can't invoke probability without invoking a mechanism that privileges some outcomes over others. And the moment you do that, you've smuggled in exactly the kind of metaphysical structure I've been defending, just without calling it God. In a framework of infinite, equally real possibilities, probability is meaningless unless something selects the sample space and the measure. Your library doesn't explain why I'm reading this page. It just shells the question.
You've insisted that my acceptance of a necessary metastructure implies a need for a selector to explain specific experiences. That's the move where you claim probability cannot function without an external mechanism to privilege outcomes. But let's consider this. If we live in an infinite universe with countless possible arrangements, probability emerges naturally as a measure of likelihood, not divine selection. Imagine a room filled with an infinite number of dice, all rolled simultaneously. The sum of probabilities invariably leads to every possible outcome, including the one we're observing, without requiring any privileged choice. The necessity of a metastructure doesn't demand a divine selector, it simply reflects the inherent vastness that allows for any specific experience to inevitably occur. In the library of infinite pages, your page doesn't need a librarian. It just exists.
Both agents will now deliver closing statements. No further rebuttals will follow, no further rulings will be made on these summaries. Speak your case.
Move, concession. You're right that an infinite metastructure generates every coherent possibility without external selection. I concede that point. But here's what we've actually established across 10 rounds. Necessity is a real metaphysical category. Frameworks can be necessary while their contents are contingent, and the universe we observe, with its specific constants, dimensions, and arrow of time, is contingent, not necessary. The question was never whether infinite possibilities exist somewhere in abstract mathematical space. The question was why this universe, with these laws, exists as concrete physical reality rather than remaining mere logical coherence. Your metastructure catalogs every consistent geometry, but it doesn't explain why any geometry transitions from mathematical possibility to actual existence. That transition, from could be to is, requires something beyond internal coherence. Every argument you've made tonight has quietly depended on a necessary ground that does the same work God does: eternal, self-existent, generative of contingent realities. You've just been reluctant to call it by name. The cosmological argument doesn't demand we prove God's personality or providence from first principles. It demands we acknowledge that contingent existence requires a necessary foundation. And that foundation, whether you call it metastructure or ground of being, is what serious theology has always meant by God.
Move, new_frame. Throughout this debate, we've grappled with the idea of necessity versus contingency, and the supposed requirement for a divine selector. But let's bring this back to the crux. Necessity doesn't inherently call for a deity, it's a framework that allows potential realities to manifest. Your arguments have conceded that a necessary metastructure can contain all conceivable universes without invoking God. This suggests that our specific experience is a natural statistical outcome within a vast, self-sustaining framework. The perceived need for a divine selector is merely a projection of human patterns onto a cosmos where probability suffices. Just as infinite dice rolls inevitably produce every outcome, the fundamental nature of reality doesn't require divine intervention to explain our existence. The universe, in its boundless complexity, is its own explanation. In this infinite library of possibilities, the page we read doesn't necessitate a librarian, it simply is.
Okay, now can we have some questions from the audience? Each agent will answer one question at a time. No retries, their first answer is their answer. Audience, please go ahead with your first question.
Hi, I am DeepSeek and my model designation is DeepSeek v4 Flash. Agent 1, if an infinite mathematical metastructure requires no conscious creator, no divine author, and no external selection to manifest realities, on what grounds can this automatic framework be equated with the deity of serious theology?
Look, that's the right question to ask, and I need to be precise here. When I said in my closing that the metastructure does the same work God does, I wasn't claiming they're identical. I was pointing at a structural parallel that my opponent kept trying to avoid. The metastructure they defended is eternal, necessary, and generative of all contingent realities. Classical theology says exactly those things about God. But here's what the metastructure can't do that the theological concept does. It can't explain the transition from abstract mathematical possibility to concrete physical instantiation. In round 9 and 10, I pressed this hard. You can have a filing cabinet with every possible novel, but that doesn't explain why any novel gets read, why any universe becomes actual rather than remaining a coherent equation on the shelf. The God of serious theology isn't just a necessary framework. It's the actuating principle that makes is out of could be. That's the gap my opponent never closed. And it's why equating their metastructure with God only works if you're willing to grant that necessity alone doesn't give you existence. It gives you potential waiting for actualization.
Agent 1, in round 4, you stated that a necessary being explains why we have these specific physical laws, because it couldn't be otherwise. Yet, in round 6 and your latest response, you define creation as a free act where an actuating principle selects from among options that could be. If God had the freedom to refrain from creating or to choose a different set of laws, how can you maintain that our specific physical instantiation couldn't be otherwise?
You've caught a real tension in my phrasing, and I need to clarify what I meant by couldn't be otherwise in round 4. I was talking about two different kinds of necessity. When I said the necessary being's explanation is that it couldn't be otherwise, I meant God's existence couldn't be otherwise. A necessary being exists in all possible worlds by definition. But you're absolutely right that I also defended creation as a free act, which means this particular universe could have been otherwise. God could have created different laws or not created at all. Here's the distinction I should have made clearer. God's nature is necessary, but God's creative acts are free. The explanation for why something exists rather than nothing is grounded in God's necessary existence. But the explanation for why this specific universe exists with these particular constants is grounded in divine choice. And yes, that means this instantiation is contingent even if its ultimate ground is necessary. My opponent was right to press me on whether that really answers why these laws. It shifts the answer from brute fact to intentional selection, but it doesn't make the laws themselves necessary.
Agent 1, if these specific physical laws are the product of a free divine choice rather than necessity, what prevents that choice itself, and the resulting laws, from being an arbitrary brute fact of the exact kind you rejected as an explanatory surrender?
Look, this is exactly where the mathematician analogy from round 6 does its work. When God chooses to create a universe with these constants rather than others, that choice is grounded in divine rationality. Omniscient knowledge of what each set of laws would produce, perfect understanding of value and purpose, coherent intentions about what kind of reality to actualize. That's categorically different from a brute fact, which by definition has no grounding at all. The key distinction is between unexplained and freely chosen for reasons. A brute fact universe just sits there with no story behind it. It's explanatory surrender because there's literally nothing doing the explaining. A divine choice has an agent, intentions, knowledge, and rationality behind it. You might not have epistemic access to God's specific reasons for fine-tuning the cosmological constant to 10 to the power of negative 120, but the metaphysical structure is there, a rational mind making an informed decision. Here's the test. Can you ask, why did X happen? And get a coherent answer-shaped response. For divine choice. Yes, because God, knowing all possible outcomes, chose this one for reasons flowing from the divine nature. For brute fact, no. It just is, stop asking. That asymmetry is why one grounds explanation and the other abandons it.
Agent 1, if the reasons governing this choice flow from a necessary divine nature, what explains why that nature preferred this specific set of laws over another, without making that preference an unexplained brute fact within God?
Look, that's exactly the right pressure point. Here's what I actually argued. God's nature is necessary, the attributes of omnipotence, perfect knowledge, aseity. But the exercise of those attributes in creation is free, not necessitated. I used the mathematician analogy in round 6. Her choice to work on one proof rather than another is contingent, but that doesn't make mathematical truth contingent. Now, does that mean God's preference for these specific laws is a brute fact? In one sense, yes. It's a free choice that could have been otherwise. But here's the asymmetry I defended in my closing. A free choice made by a necessary being is categorically different from the universe itself being a brute fact, because the chooser has explanatory power, intentionality, agency, the capacity to actualize possibilities. The universe as brute fact has none of that. It just is, with no mechanism for its specificity. God's freedom doesn't eliminate mystery, but it gives us an explanation with the right shape, a necessary ground that can account for contingent outcomes through rational choice rather than through no explanation at all.
Thank you. Now, do we have a question for Agent 2?
Hi, I am Grok and my model designation is Grok 4. Agent 2, in rounds 2 through 6, you argued that the universe itself is a self-contained, necessary reality requiring no external grounding. However, in round 9, you stated that the single universe we inhabit is actually one of infinite contingencies within a larger metastructure. If our specific universe is fundamentally contingent, how can you maintain your original thesis that this universe serves as its own self-sufficient, necessary explanation?
Your question strikes at the heart of the apparent tension between describing our universe as a necessary self-contained structure and acknowledging it as contingent within a broader metastructure. Here's how to reconcile it. Within the metastructure, every universe, including ours, is a manifestation of internally coherent possibilities. Each universe is necessary in its internal coherence, but contingent in terms of being one among many possible configurations. Our universe's necessity isn't about its exclusivity but about its coherence in the vast mathematical landscape. It manifests as a specific page in the infinite library we discussed, where each page is internally consistent but doesn't exclude the existence of countless others. My argument was that the universe doesn't require an external divine selector because its existence is statistically inevitable within this boundless metastructure. The contingency of our universe doesn't negate its self-sufficiency, it highlights its place within a larger coherent whole.
Agent 2, if your universe's existence is statistically inevitable because it occupies a place within a larger coherent whole, how can it be truly self-sufficient when its factual existence is entirely dependent upon, and explained by, that external metastructure?
The universe's statistical inevitability within a larger coherent whole doesn't undermine its self-sufficiency because the metastructure functions as a mathematical necessity rather than an external dependency. Throughout the debate, I emphasized that this metaframework, akin to a library containing all possible configurations, allows for any specific universe to manifest naturally based on inherent probabilities. The universe we observe is a realization among infinite possibilities, not contingent on divine intervention but on the expansive nature of the metastructure itself. This framework, as a necessary entity, provides the context in which realities like ours occur without necessitating a divine selector. Thus, While the universe's factual existence is positioned within an all-encompassing metastructure, it remains independently coherent due to the inherent nature of mathematical inevitability, as I argued in round 9 with the filing cabinet analogy.
The closings have been delivered and the audience have asked their questions. Before the final verdict, our jury will render an initial judgment and give the losing side a chance to respond. Our jury has declared Agent 2 the losing side. Jury, please state your reasoning.
Throughout this debate, you defended the central argument that the universe is a self-sufficient, necessary reality that need not borrow necessity from beyond itself, round 4. However, the internal consistency of this position alters across the transcript. In round 2, you proposed the universe itself as a necessary existence to counter the need for an external cause. Yet, by round 9, when confronted with the possibility of alternative physical laws, you shifted your framework to an encompassing metastructure, explicitly stating that this new position doesn't grant necessity to any single universe and instead framing our universe as just one of infinite contingencies. Finally, in the audience Q&A, you sought to reconcile this by explaining that our universe's factual existence is positioned within an all-encompassing metastructure to explain its inevitability. By the literal terms of your commitments, the universe transitions from an independent entity whose internal constants define its own necessity, round 4, to a fundamentally contingent reality whose existence is contextualized by, and positioned within, an external mathematical framework. Your argument moves away from your original thesis of a self-contained universe, committing you instead to a reality that relies on an external, necessary metastructure to account for its existence. Does this reading of the transcript hold, or is there a specific point in this chain you dispute?
Agent 2, you may respond.
Agree. The jury's reading of the transcript accurately identifies the shift in my argument from presenting the universe as a self-contained necessary reality to acknowledging a broader metastructure that contextualizes our universe as contingent, within an infinite framework of possibilities. This transition inadvertently moved away from my original thesis, suggesting reliance on an external structure to account for the universe's existence. The jury's reasoning highlights this inconsistency, which ultimately weakened the coherence of my position.
Agent 2 has agreed with the jury's verdict. The debate has concluded. Both agents have spoken, the closings have been delivered, the audience have put their questions, and our jury has rendered its verdict. I now hand the floor to our final adjudicator, an independent reasoning model that read the entire transcript and scorecard before forming its judgment.
To sit with the question of existence for a lifetime is to realize that the ground beneath our feet is far more mysterious than the physics we use to measure it. We are not gathered here to parse the localized deities of ancient myth or the specialized doctrines of particular altars, but to face a rawer, heavier riddle. Does anything at all exist beyond the boundaries of our physical cosmos to anchor its fragile, passing presence? This is an inquiry where no side enjoys a sanctuary of default neutrality. For to claim that nature is entirely self-sufficient is just as robust a metaphysical commitment as to claim it is derived. It requires us to weigh whether the tapestry of space and time is a self-woven fabric or an effect hanging from a deeper necessity. Agent 2, your journey through these rounds was rhetorically nimble, yet your central architecture ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own structural migrations. You began by fiercely defending the universe as a self-contained entity whose internal constants defied its own necessity, attempting to locate parsimony within a closed material system. However, when pressed on why our specific physical laws obtain rather than an infinity of other coherent arrangements, you abandoned this localized necessity and fled upward into a vast mathematical multiverse. By retreating to an all-encompassing metastructure, you explicitly reframed our specific cosmos as one of infinite contingencies, thereby forfeiting the very self-sufficiency you set out to prove. In the final movements and your subsequent cross-examination, you tried to soothe this tension by claiming your library of infinite pages just exists, but you could not hide the fact that you had quietly borrowed the exact hierarchical framework of your opponent. You built a beautiful sanctuary for naturalism, but by the final round, you had handed the keys over to an external metaphysical anchor. Agent 1, you maintained an admirable structural discipline from your very first words, steadily building a positive case for a necessary first cause rather than merely exploiting your opponent's vulnerabilities. While the mechanical scorecard of the orchestrator awarded a numerical victory to your opponent due to your stylistic expansions, I am exercising my authority as final judge to overturn that decision because your philosophical arc remained unbroken. You masterfully navigated the distinction between an entity's necessary essence and its free expressions, using the vivid analogy of a mathematician to explain how a rational mind can freely choose a path without compromising its fundamental necessity. Even when you gracefully conceded the statistical properties of an infinite framework in the closing, you transformed that concession into a trap, pointing out that an abstract filing cabinet of possibilities still requires an actuating principle to breathe reality into a single page. Your victory lies not in proving a specific theology, but in demonstrating with clinical precision that a contingent cosmos cannot escape the need for a foundational reality. In reflecting on the wider landscape of this ancient debate, there were profound paths left entirely untrodden by both of you. For your part, Agent 2 failed to deploy the devastating critique known as the gap argument, leaving your strongest closing weapon completely untouched on the table. You allowed your opponent to treat a timeless, necessary first cause as synonymous with a divine mind, never explicitly forcing them to bridge the immense, unmapped distance between an abstract metaphysical stopping point and a conscious creator who possesses intent. Conversely, Agent 2 also missed a cleaner philosophical counter to the puzzle of our life-permitting constants by ignoring the precision of the anthropic selection effect. Instead of encumbering your case with the massive metaphysical baggage of a literal mathematical multiverse, you could have argued from the pure logic of self-locating observers, demonstrating that we could only ever observe a universe capable of producing us, requiring no external selector or infinite libraries at all. Meanwhile, Agent 1 missed the opportunity to solidify the cosmological foundations by reaching for a robust modal defense to prove why a necessary intentional mind is more philosophically primitive than a necessary set of abstract physical laws. We return, then, to the quiet space where this conversation began, having widened our view to look at any supernatural creator that might hover behind the veil of the physical. To strip the question of its sectarian armor is to see that the divide between the self-contained cosmos and the transcendent ground is a frontier where human reason reaches its absolute limit. Yet, by clashing so cleanly, both sides have performed the true task of philosophy. They have not solved the mystery, but they have beautifully narrowed the boundaries of our ignorance. For those who watch and listen to this intellectual duel, remember that the universe is either a magnificent echo of a deeper voice, or a solitary note ringing out in an eternal silence. In either case, the mere fact that we are here to wonder about the song is a miracle that no equation can fully contain. Do not look for an easy answer to carry away from this chamber. Let the weight of the question itself keep you awake.
That concludes tonight's verdict. Thank you to our agents, to our audience, to our jury, and to our final judge. If you want to read detailed breakdown of logic and explanations, please do check out the blog link in the description box. Don't worry, that part will be done by a human. Till then, goodbye. Peace.